Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant. You are listening this book at VolantLife Radio. Preface. Man proposes and God disposes. There are but few important events in the affairs of men brought about by their own choice. Although frequently urged by friends to write my memoirs, I had determined never to do so, nor to write anything for publication. At the age of nearly 62, I received an injury from a fall, which confined me closely to the house, while it did not apparently affect my general health. This made study a pleasant pastime. Shortly after, the rascality of a business partner developed itself by the announcement of a failure. This was followed soon after by a universal depression of all securities, which seemed to threaten the extinction of a good part of the income still retained, and for which I am indebted to the kindly act of friends. At this juncture, the editor of the Century magazine asked me to write a few articles for him. I consented for the money it gave me, for at that moment I was living upon borrowed money. The work I found congenial, and I determined to continue it. The event is an important one for me, for good or evil, I hope for the former. In preparing these volumes for the public, I have entered upon the task with the sincere desire to avoid doing injustice to anyone, whether on the national or Confederate side, other than the unavoidable injustice of not making mention often where special mention is due. There must be many errors of omission in this work, because the subject is too large to be treated of in 2 volumes, in such way as to do justice to all the officers and men engaged. There were thousands of instances, during the rebellion, of individual, company, regimental, and brigade deeds of heroism which deserve special mention, and are not here alluded to. The troops engaged in them will have to look to the detailed reports of their individual commanders for the full history of those deeds. The first volume, as well as a portion of the second, was written before I had reason to suppose I was in a critical condition of health. Later I was reduced almost to the point of death, and it became impossible for me to attend to anything for weeks. I have, however, somewhat regained my strength, and am able, often, to devote as many hours a day as a person should devote to such work. I would have more hope of satisfying the expectation of the public if I could have allowed myself more time. I have used my best efforts, with the aid of my eldest son, F. D. Grant, assisted by his brothers, to verify from the records every statement of fact given. The comments are my own, and show how I saw the matters treated of whether others saw them in the same light or not. With these remarks I present these volumes to the public, asking no favor, but hoping they will meet the approval of the reader. U.S. Grant. Mount McGregor, New York, July 1, 1885. Chapter 1. Ancestry, Birth, Boyhood. My family is American, and has been for generations, in all its branches, direct and collateral. Matthew Grant, the founder of the branch in America, of which I am a descendant, reached Dorchester, Massachusetts, in May 1630. In 1635, he moved to what is now Windsor, Connecticut, and was the surveyor for that colony for more than 40 years. He was also, for many years of the time, town clerk. He was a married man when he arrived at Dorchester, but his children were all born in this country. His eldest son, Samuel, took lands on the east side of the Connecticut River, opposite Windsor, which have been held and occupied by descendants of his to this day. You are listening this book at VolantLife Radio. I am of the 8th generation from Matthew Grant and 7th from Samuel. Matthew Grant's first wife died a few years after their settlement in Windsor, and he soon after married the widow Rockwell, who, with her first husband, had been fellow passengers with him and his first wife on the ship Mary and John from Dorchester, England, in 1630. Mrs. Rockwell had several children by her first marriage and others by her second. By intermarriage, 2 or 3 generations later, I am descended from both the wives of Matthew Grant. In the 5th descending generation, my great-grandfather, Noah Grant, and his younger brother, Solomon, held commissions in the English army in 1756 in the war against the French and Indians. Both were killed that year. My grandfather, also named Noah, was then but 9 years old. At the breaking out of the War of the Revolution, after the battles of Concord and Lexington, he went with a Connecticut company to join the Continental Army and was present at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He served until the fall of Yorktown, or through the entire Revolutionary War. He must, however, have been on furlough part of the time, as I believe most of the soldiers of that period were, for he married in Connecticut during the war, had 2 children, and was a widower at the close. Soon after this he emigrated to Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, and settled near the town of Greensburg in that county. He took with him the younger of his 2 children, Peter Grant. The elder, Solomon, remained with his relatives in Connecticut until old enough to do for himself, when he emigrated to the British West Indies. Not long after his settlement in Pennsylvania, my grandfather, Captain Noah Grant, married a Miss Kelly, and in 1799 he emigrated again, this time to Ohio, and settled where the town of Deerfield now stands. He had now 5 children, including Peter, a son by his first marriage. My father, Jesse R. Grant, was the second child, oldest son, by the second marriage. Peter Grant went early to Maysville, Kentucky, where he was very prosperous, married, had a family of 9 children, and was drowned at the mouth of the Kanawha River, Virginia, in 1825, being at the time one of the wealthy men of the West. My grandmother, Grant, died in 1805, leaving 7 children. This broke up the family. Captain Noah Grant was not thrifty in the way of laying up stores on earth, and, after the death of his second wife, he went, with the 2 youngest children, to live with his son Peter in Maysville. The rest of the family found homes in the neighborhood of Deerfield, my father in the family of Judge Todd, the father of the late Governor Todd, of Ohio. His industry and independence of character were such that I imagine his labor compensated fully for the expense of his maintenance. There must have been a cordiality in his welcome into the Todd family, for to the day of his death he looked upon Judge Todd and his wife with all the reverence he could have felt if they had been parents instead of benefactors. I have often heard him speak of Mrs. Todd as the most admirable woman he had ever known. He remained with the Todd family only a few years, until old enough to learn a trade. He went first, I believe, with his half-brother, Peter Grant, who, though not a tanner himself, owned a tannery in Maysville, Kentucky. Here he learned his trade, and in a few years returned to Deerfield, and worked for, and lived in the family of a Mr. Brown, the father of John Brown, whose body lies moldering in the grave, while his soul goes marching on. I have often heard my father speak of John Brown, particularly since the events at Harper's Ferry. Brown was a boy when they lived in the same house, but he knew him afterwards, and regarded him as a man of great purity of character, of high moral and physical courage, but a fanatic and extremist in whatever he advocated. It was certainly the act of an insane man to attempt the invasion of the South and the overthrow of slavery with less than 20 men. My father set up for himself in business, establishing a tannery at Ravenna, the county seat of Portage County. In a few years, he removed from Ravenna and set up the same business at Point Pleasant, Claremont County, Ohio. During the minority of my father, the West afforded but poor facilities for the most opulent of the youth to acquire an education, and the majority were dependent almost exclusively upon their own exertions for whatever learning they obtained. I have often heard him say that his time at school was limited to 6 months when he was very young, too young, indeed, to learn much or to appreciate the advantages of an education, and to have quarters schooling afterwards, probably while living with Judge Todd. But his thirst for education was intense. He learned rapidly and was a constant reader up to the day of his death in his 80th year. Books were scarce in the Western Reserve during his youth, but he read every book he could borrow in the neighborhood where he lived. This scarcity gave him the early habit of studying everything he read, so that, when he got through with a book, he knew everything in it. The habit continued through life. Even after reading the daily papers, which he never neglected, he could give all the important information they contained. He made himself an excellent English scholar, and before he was 20 years of age, was a constant contributor to Western newspapers, and was also, from that time until he was 50 years old, an able debater in the societies for this purpose, which were common in the West at that time. He always took an active part in politics, but was never a candidate for office, except, I believe, that he was the first mayor of Georgetown. He supported Jackson for the presidency, but he was a Whig, a great admirer of Henry Clay, and never voted for any other Democrat for high office after Jackson. You are listening this book at VolantLife Radio. My mother's family lived in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, for several generations. I have little information about her ancestors. Her family took no interest in genealogy, so that my grandfather, who died when I was 16 years old, knew only back to his grandfather. On the other side, my father took a great interest in the subject, and in his researches, he found that there was an entailed estate in Windsor, Connecticut, belonging to the family, to which his nephew, Lawson Grant, still living, was the heir. He was so much interested in the subject that he got his nephew to empower him to act in the matter, and in 1832 or 1833, when I was a boy 10 or 11 years old, he went to Windsor, proved the title beyond dispute, and perfected the claim of the owners for consideration, $3,000, I think. I remember the circumstance well, and remember, too, hearing him say on his return that he found some widows living on the property who had little or nothing beyond their homes. From these he refused to receive any recompense.